Hey, I'm Bea, and today I'm going to be talking about why drug policy is a feminist issue.
Look, oh my God, the people walking, the people talking, people talking. Facade.
So it's clear that all people who use drugs can be stigmatised and criminalised. However, drug policy discussions and decisions have long been focused and centred on cis men. They are often the standard for which others are compared to. And this means that much of the data, research and analysis of what we know about drugs and drug policy has been framed by these men alone. Women, trans and gender non-conforming individuals often face additional, different and particular sets of challenges which can be silenced, ignored or just not considered when we talk about the harms of prohibition. There's a real lack of data surrounding these individuals, their lived experiences of substances and how they are affected by the restrictive laws associated with them. What knowledge we do have is often repackaged to fit the dominant framework which has long been generated by and from cis men. This lack of information or understanding often leads to further stigmatisation, particularly when individuals appear to go against what's expected of them by society. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about women in particular and how they may experience greater prejudice and judgment due to gendered societal expectations of them. Being missed out of these important discussions, they are often invisible in drug policy. But not only that, those involved with substances are often cast as immoral or abnormal for going against the dominant narrative of how women should be and behave. As women traditionally are expected to be caregivers, their involvement with drugs has very specific gendered consequences and repercussions. Pregnant women or mothers often face additional stigma and as a result may not access the care and support they need for fear of criminalisation and disruption of family life. During my interview with Clemmie James, we talked about some of the gendered aspects of drug policy, and the example she gives here really helps highlight the issues that women can face and the impact this can have going forward. It also demonstrates how services for women using substances must take into account the particular needs and nuanced situations of each individual and provide non-critical, supportive and sensitive care free of judgment and assumptions. So over to Clemmie now.
But my daughter was conceived while I was on mushrooms. And I told my midwife this in my first appointment. And I just told her because she asked me whether I took anything. And I was like, oh, well, I'll just be honest. You know, I picked them. I knew what it was. It was like, like, everything stopped. I was rushed to have, all these leaflets of social, it was just absolute showdown. And my partner was like, why did you say anything? And I was like, wow, why did I say anything? Like, I am never mentioning that ever again. And I talked my way out of it. And it was a massive realization that it wasn't to do with what I'd taken. It was to do with the fact that I was a woman, that I was pregnant, that I didn't have agency or choice, that I had made a mistake, that it was problematic, and that I would be problematic moving forward, i.e. the pregnancy, the child. And so what that taught me was that silence was better. And that's a really small example of something that I believe is a totally manageable form of drug use. But can you only have to imagine, like, if you take more, anything else, that you're just going to avoid sharing that. You are going to avoid going to the services. You are going to miss appointments because there is such a lack of understanding, there's so much stigma around what that can mean. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily safe. I'm not saying that the midwife did exactly what she was meant to do. It was just an awareness for me that if there was anything else, I should probably just never mention it. And so instead of creating an environment that's honest, where I could access that support in a non-judgmental, dignified way, it wasn't. It was just panic. And my sister's a midwife, and she says one of the biggest problems is obviously smoking. Luckily, she's got a lot of sympathy for women who are giving up, as a result of being pregnant, and she advocates for them giving up. It's what she does. She also smokes, so she understands that it's really difficult. And I just think that sometimes that balance is a little bit more humane and a little bit more real for women going through that process. And you know, I think looking at alcohol and tobacco, two of the most dangerous substances in the world, if overused or in problematic ways, and yet that has been managed in a way that is we manage it in a health perspective, that you are supported through that process if we're talking about women and sort of pregnancy and fertility. Whereas if it's drugs, it's just like you fear criminalization, you fear being thought of as totally stupid, mad, you know, mental, like it's just that it unravels. And so what it does for women is it just makes them go, okay, and so we create this sort of cycle.
As women and gender diverse individuals are increasingly incarcerated around the world for substance possession and use, it's really important to consider how the consequences of the war on drugs can be gendered. For example, women tend to be most involved in the lower levels of the drugs trade, where the greatest concentration of arrests occur. Their roles as cultivators or traffickers can make them more vulnerable to experiencing violence and coercion. We've discussed in the past few weeks that the consequences of drug prohibition and criminalisation are not evenly distributed, but often disproportionately target communities of colour, the poor and the vulnerable. This is reflected within the women currently incarcerated for drug-related offences. Women who use drugs occupy multiple identities, often linked to their employment, migration and social status. Certain women will face additional barriers related to their sexuality, race, religion, class and ability. All of this, on top of their gender, will ultimately determine the treatment they receive. This is why an intersectional approach is really necessary, to understand how these individual identities and the interlocking systems of oppression interact with drug policy. Intersectional feminist movements have long pushed for the rights of those oppressed by power structures in society. They advocate that everyone should enjoy their fundamental rights and freedoms without discrimination in all areas of life. However, for a long time, women and gender non-conforming people who use drugs and who are engaged in illicit drug economies have been left out of the broader feminist movements, despite the fact that the impacts of the drug war, including gender-based violence, incarceration and economic justice, are issues often central to feminist movements. Increasingly, those directly affected by the war on drugs are seeking to break down the walls that separate drug policy reform and feminist movements, proving that building solidarity between the two can strengthen them both. Feminism helps us to break down the binary between good and bad and right and wrong, and has clear links with harm reduction approaches. We must listen to women and gender diverse people who use drugs to help challenge these systems of oppression that only serve to act as barriers to compassionate and dignified care. During our interview, Clemmie also talked about how we can learn from other feminist movements, such as pro-choice advocacy, to better understand the real intentions and focus of drug policy reform. So I'll hand over to her again now.
While there is a lot of destigmatizing, there is still this enormous fear that drug reform equals pushing drugs, that we mean you should all take drugs, or we're saying that they're not dangerous, just go and help yourself. That isn't at all what we're saying. At the moment I was like, of course, this is sort of like how we need to think about this narrative. Was a conversation again with my sister, who's a pro-choice campaigner and has done a lot of work in Northern Ireland on abortion rights. And she said, you know what, Clemmie, this is really similar to the fight for pro-choice. She said, you know, when we talk as campaigners and advocates for safe abortions, when we talk to pro-lifers, as they're called, or is that the opposite of being pro-life is not pro-abortion. You're not walking around the world going like, everyone have an abortion. That's not what's happening. What you're asking for is choice, that a woman has the ability to make that choice. That nobody, no political party or person has imposed a system that is so dangerous that she will still access an abortion through the most dangerous means. What the opposite of pro-life is pro-choice. It's not pro-abortion. And I think that we need to place ourselves in drug policy in a really drug policy reform in a really similar way, that we're not trying to like advocate for everyone to go and take mushrooms or go and, you know, take heroin or whatever. If you do or you don't, it's not about showing judgment. It's not about saying you should or shouldn't, or you should do this one or not that one. It's irrelevant. It's creating an honest approach to the fact that humans are humans and will need to do things in their lives, and they need to be able to do that in a dignified and safe and supportive way. And for most of the time, it's actually nobody else's business if they're not harming anyone else.
You talk to you, talk to me.